In a 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, watched by over 90 million people worldwide, Michael Jackson sat in the living room of his Neverland ranch and spoke about his father. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. When Oprah asked about his childhood, about the stories of physical punishment and grueling rehearsals, Jackson's eyes filled with tears. He described being so afraid of his father that he would sometimes vomit at the sight of him. He talked about the beatings, the insults, the relentless pressure to be perfect. And then he said something that would echo through the rest of his life. There's a lot of sadness in my past life. I just wish I could have had the childhood that I never had. That interview gave the world a glimpse into the psychological foundation upon which Michael Jackson's extraordinary talent was built. It was a foundation constructed by Joe Jackson, a man whose methods produced some of the most successful entertainers in history, but also, according to his children and numerous psychologists, inflicted deep and lasting trauma. The question that has lingered for decades is not whether Joe Jackson's methods worked in terms of creating success, but rather what price that success demanded from the children who paid it. Joseph Walter Jackson was born in 1928 in Arkansas and grew up in a world of poverty and limited opportunities. His own childhood was marked by hardship, and he carried the scars of that experience into his adult life. He moved to Gary, Indiana in the late 1940s seeking better prospects. He worked as a crane operator at a steel mill, a physically demanding job that paid enough to support a family but offered little in the way of advancement or fulfillment. Joe had once harbored dreams of being a musician himself. He played guitar in a local rhythm and blues band called the Falcons, performing at small venues and dreaming of something bigger. But those dreams never materialized, and as his family grew, the responsibilities of providing for them took precedence over his musical ambitions. By the early 1960s, Joe Jackson was the father of 9 children, living in a small 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street in Gary. The household was crowded, money was tight, and Joe was determined that his children would not suffer the same limitations he had faced. When he noticed that several of his sons, Tito, Jackie, and Jermaine, had musical talent, he saw an opportunity. He began to organize them into a group, teaching them songs, choreographing routines, and pushing them to practice relentlessly. Michael, the 7th child, was initially too young to participate, but by the time he was 5 years old in 1963, his exceptional singing voice and natural sense of rhythm made him an obvious addition to what would become the Jackson Five. Joe Jackson's approach to managing his children's musical education was built on discipline, fear, and an uncompromising demand for perfection. Rehearsals took place in the family's small living room, and often lasted for hours, extending late into the night on school days and consuming entire weekends. Joe would sit in a chair with a belt in his hand, watching every move, listening to every note. Mistakes were met with verbal abuse and physical punishment. According to multiple accounts from the Jackson children, Joe would hit them with the belt, sometimes on their hands, sometimes on their legs or backs, if they missed a step or sang off-key. The message was clear. Perfection was expected, and failure would be punished. The psychological impact of this environment on young Michael was profound. Child development experts who have studied the effects of authoritarian parenting and physical punishment note that children raised in such conditions often develop heightened anxiety, low self-esteem, and difficulty trusting others. They may internalize the belief that they are only valuable when they perform well, that love and approval are conditional upon meeting impossible standards. For Michael Jackson, these patterns would manifest throughout his life in ways both obvious and subtle. His perfectionism in the recording studio, his meticulous attention to detail in his performances, and his relentless work ethic were all, in part, products of the training he received under Joe's supervision. But so too were his reported struggles with self-image, his difficulty forming stable relationships, and his apparent inability to experience unconditional love or acceptance. The physical punishment was not the only form of control Joe exercised. According to Michael and several of his siblings, Joe also engaged in psychological manipulation and intimidation. Michael later recounted incidents in which Joe would wear a mask and climb through his bedroom window at night to frighten him, ostensibly to teach him to keep the window locked for security reasons. Whether this actually happened or was a manifestation of childhood fear is unclear, but Michael spoke of it in interviews as a real and terrifying experience. The fear it instilled was not abstract. It was visceral and ever-present. Michael described being unable to sleep, lying awake in fear, his sense of safety and security fundamentally compromised. The success of the Jackson Five seemed to validate Joe's methods, at least in the eyes of the industry and the public. By 1969, the group had signed with Motown Records, one of the most prestigious labels in the world. Their first four singles, I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There, all reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Michael, as the lead singer, became the face of the group. At 11 years old, he was a star, performing on television, touring the country, and earning money that would lift the Jackson family out of poverty. For Joe, this was the realization of his dream, proof that his strict methods had produced results. But for Michael, success came at a cost that would take decades to fully understand. Child psychologists have identified a phenomenon known as parentification, in which a child is forced to take on adult responsibilities and becomes a source of emotional or financial support for their parents. Michael Jackson's experience fits this pattern. He was not just a child performer, he was the primary breadwinner for his family by the time he was a preteen. The pressure to perform, to generate income, to meet the expectations of his father, his record label, and millions of fans was immense. And unlike adult performers who can compartmentalize their work and personal lives, Michael had no separation. His identity, his value, and his sense of self were entirely bound up in his ability to sing, dance, and entertain. The dynamics within the Jackson family were complex and shaped by the cultural and economic context of the time. Joe Jackson grew up in an era when physical discipline was widely accepted, even encouraged as a method of child rearing. Many parents of his generation believed that sparing the rod would spoil the child, that strict discipline was necessary to instill respect and work ethic. In African American communities, where the stakes of failure were often higher due to systemic racism and limited opportunities, the pressure to succeed and the methods used to ensure that success were sometimes even more intense. Joe saw himself as preparing his children for a harsh world, toughening them up so they could survive and thrive in an industry that was unforgiving, particularly to black artists. But even within that context, Joe's methods were extreme. Multiple Jackson children have spoken publicly about the abuse they endured, and their accounts are consistent across decades of interviews. Jermaine Jackson, one of the older brothers, has defended his father at times, arguing that Joe's strictness was born of love and a desire to see his children succeed. But even Jermaine has acknowledged the harshness of the punishments and the fear that permeated the household. LaToya Jackson, Michael's sister, wrote in her autobiography about the physical and emotional abuse she and her siblings experienced, describing an atmosphere of terror in which the children were too afraid to speak up or defend themselves. Janet Jackson, the youngest, has spoken about the lasting impact of growing up in such an environment, describing feelings of inadequacy and a constant need to prove herself. Michael's relationship with his father was particularly fraught. As the most talented and successful of the children, Michael bore the brunt of Joe's expectations and his wrath when those expectations were not met. But Michael also received the most attention, the most coaching, and the most investment of Joe's time and energy. This created a complicated dynamic in which Michael both resented and sought his father's approval. In interviews, Michael often expressed a desire for his father to tell him he was proud, to show affection, to offer the kind of unconditional love that he felt he had never received. Joe, for his part, seemed incapable of providing that. He was a manager, a taskmaster, a disciplinarian, but rarely a nurturing father. The psychological literature on the effects of childhood trauma is extensive and offers insight into Michael Jackson's adult behavior. Trauma, particularly when it occurs during critical developmental periods, can alter the brain's structure and function. Children who experience chronic stress, fear, and unpredictability may develop hyperactive stress response systems, making them more prone to anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder in adulthood. They may also struggle with emotional regulation, have difficulty forming secure attachments, and engage in behaviors aimed at soothing or escaping emotional pain, such as substance use or compulsive activities. Michael Jackson's adult life bore many of these hallmarks. He was known for his perfectionism, which could be understood as a continuation of the impossibly high standards instilled by his father. He had difficulty trusting people, often surrounding himself with employees and associates rather than forming deep, equal friendships. He spoke frequently about his loneliness, about feeling misunderstood and isolated, despite being one of the most famous people in the world. His relationships with children, which became a source of controversy and legal trouble, may also have been rooted in his disrupted childhood. Some psychologists have suggested that Michael identified more with children than adults because he himself had never been allowed to be a child, that his friendships with young people were an attempt to reclaim something he had lost. Michael's use of prescription medications, which ultimately contributed to his death in 2009, can also be viewed through the lens of trauma and coping mechanisms. People who have experienced significant childhood trauma are statistically more likely to develop substance use disorders, not because of a moral failing, but because they are seeking relief from psychological pain that feels unbearable. Michael spoke openly in his later years about his struggles with pain, both physical and emotional, and his reliance on medications to manage that pain. Whether the roots of that dependence can be traced back to his childhood is a question that psychologists and biographers have debated, but the connection is difficult to ignore. Joe Jackson's defenders, and there are some, argue that he did what he believed was necessary to give his children opportunities they would not have had otherwise. They point to the success of the Jackson Five, to Michael's solo career, to Janet's achievements, and to the wealth and fame the family attained. They note that Joe himself came from a background of abuse and poverty, that he was a product of his time and his circumstances, and that he was doing the best he could with the tools he had. They argue that judging him by contemporary standards of parenting is unfair, that the cultural norms of the 1960s and 1970s were different, and that many children of that era experienced similar discipline without suffering lasting harm. But the counter-argument is equally compelling. Even if Joe's methods were rooted in the norms of his time, the outcomes speak for themselves. Michael Jackson was a deeply troubled adult who struggled with his sense of self, his relationships, and his mental health. His siblings have described similar struggles, including battles with addiction, failed marriages, and ongoing psychological issues. The success they achieved came at a significant personal cost, and that cost was borne by children who had no choice in the matter. The question is not whether Joe Jackson intended to harm his children, but whether the harm occurred regardless of his intentions. Psychologists who have studied the Jackson family dynamic from a distance, using publicly available information and interviews, have identified several patterns consistent with dysfunctional family systems. One is the presence of a dominant, authoritarian figure who rules through fear and control. Another is the lack of emotional safety, in which children do not feel secure expressing their feelings or needs. A third is role confusion, in which children are expected to fulfill adult roles or meet adult expectations. And a fourth is the absence of unconditional love, replaced instead by conditional approval based on performance or compliance. These patterns create what trauma therapists call complex trauma, a form of psychological injury that results from prolonged exposure to harmful environments rather than from a single traumatic event. Complex trauma affects not just specific memories or reactions, but the entire personality, shaping how a person sees themselves, others, and the world. For Michael Jackson, the effects of complex trauma were visible in his adult behavior. His difficulty trusting others, his need for control in his professional life, his simultaneous craving for and fear of intimacy, and his attempts to create an idealized childhood for himself and others through Neverland Ranch, and his relationships with children. The relationship between Joe and Michael did not improve significantly as Michael became an adult. Michael fired his father as his manager in the early 1980s, a move that was both professionally necessary and personally symbolic. By that point, Michael had outgrown his father's management capabilities. The music industry had evolved, and Michael's career required sophisticated business acumen and global strategic thinking that Joe simply did not possess. But the firing was also an assertion of independence, a statement that Michael was no longer willing to be controlled by the man who had dominated his childhood. Joe reportedly reacted poorly to being fired, seeing it as a betrayal and a rejection. The rift between father and son deepened over the years, with Michael maintaining minimal contact with Joe, even as he remained close to his mother, Catherine. In interviews, Michael rarely spoke about his father without visible pain, and when he did, it was often to reiterate the hurt and fear he had experienced. Joe, for his part, seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge the harm he had caused. In his few public statements about his parenting, he defended his methods, arguing that they had been necessary and effective. He expressed frustration that his children, particularly Michael, did not show him more gratitude for the success he had helped them achieve. This inability to reconcile to have an honest conversation about the past and its impact is common in families where trauma has occurred. The person who caused the harm often cannot afford to acknowledge it, because doing so would require confronting their own guilt and the possibility that their actions were wrong. The person who experienced the harm, meanwhile, continues to carry the weight of it, often waiting for an apology or acknowledgement that never comes. For Michael Jackson, this lack of resolution was another source of pain, another wound that never fully healed. The public's understanding of Joe Jackson's role in Michael's life has evolved over time. In the early years of the Jackson 5, Joe was often portrayed as a savvy manager who had discovered and developed his children's talent. As the years went on and Michael began to speak more openly about his childhood, the narrative shifted. Joe became a more controversial figure, seen by many as an abusive father who had prioritized success over his children's well-being. After Michael's death in 2009, the debate intensified. Some saw Joe as a tragic figure, a man who had done terrible things but who also loved his children in his own flawed way. Others saw him as unrepentant, someone who continued to justify his actions and who showed little understanding of the pain he had caused. Joe Jackson died in June 2018 at the age of 89. In the days following his death, the Jackson family released statements expressing their grief and acknowledging his role in their success. But notably, some of the statements were measured, even cautious, lacking the warmth and affection typically associated with eulogies. The complexity of their feelings, the mix of gratitude, resentment, love, and pain, was evident even in their carefully chosen words. Michael, of course, was not there to offer his own statement, having died 9 years earlier. But his interviews, his music, and his life had already provided a testament to the impact his father had on him. The broader question raised by the Jackson family story is one that resonates beyond celebrity and entertainment. What is the cost of success, and who decides whether that cost is worth paying? Joe Jackson made a decision to push his children toward greatness, and by conventional measures he succeeded. But the greatness came with suffering, and the children who achieved it did not consent to the methods used to get them there. They were too young to consent, too powerless to resist, and too invested in pleasing their father to fully understand what was being taken from them. Psychologists who work with trauma survivors often speak about the importance of agency, the ability to make choices about one's own life, and to have those choices respected. The Jackson children had no agency in their childhoods. Their talents were recognized and exploited, their time was consumed by rehearsals and performances, and their emotional needs were subordinated to the demands of success. The impact of that lack of agency extended into their adult lives, manifesting in struggles with control, identity, and self-worth. For Michael Jackson specifically, the psychological impact of his childhood was inseparable from his artistry. His music, particularly in his later albums, was filled with themes of pain, longing, and a search for healing. Songs like Childhood, from the History album, explicitly addressed his lost youth and the sadness he carried. The lyrics spoke of a boy who never got to play, who was forced to grow up too fast, and who spent his adult life trying to reclaim what had been taken. In that sense, Michael's music was not just entertainment, it was therapy, an attempt to process and communicate the emotions he struggled to express in other ways. The relationship between creativity and trauma is well documented. Many artists draw on their pain as a source of inspiration, channeling their suffering into work that resonates with others who have experienced similar struggles. Michael Jackson's ability to connect with audiences on such a deep emotional level may have been rooted in part in the authenticity of the pain he expressed. People could feel the vulnerability in his voice, the yearning in his performances, because it was real. But the cost of that authenticity was a life spent carrying wounds that never fully healed. In the end, the story of Joe Jackson and Michael Jackson is not a simple one of villain and victim. It is a story about family, about ambition, about the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next, and about the ways in which love and harm can coexist in the same relationship. Joe Jackson was a man shaped by his own difficult past who used the tools he knew to try to create a better future for his children. But those tools caused damage, and that damage rippled through Michael's life in ways that shaped his relationships, his mental health, and ultimately his fate. Understanding this does not excuse the harm, but it does provide context, a reminder that people are complex, that motivations are mixed, and that the legacies we leave are often more complicated than we intend.